the attention can turn to the Minnesota legislature. It can turn to the epicenter of what happened 3.5 weeks ago with George Floyd's murder. It is the week of the Clayton Jackson McGee centennial commemoration. It is a whole lot of things coming to a point, and it is being led by community asking for reforms. So we're here today to talk about those proposals. We're going to talk about it again. So far, we're still in gridlock. So far, we've had this entire week to move things, but now is the time. We keep hearing that legislators in the Senate, that the majority wants to go home tomorrow. Minnesotans want them to do the work. Minnesotans want them to do the work that has been put on the table. And today, you're going to hear a debate in the House that is going to be a real debate. As you saw on Saturday, 7 hours of emotional testimony, 7 hours of asking questions, 7 hours of expert witnesses, and then coming back now to debate it and bring it to it. That is in contrast to the Senate's hearing that expert witnesses who have worked in the case of some of these folks for 40 years in law enforcement and criminal justice reform were given 3 minutes while they were interrupted during that time. No debate, simply brought to the floor. That's not how the democracy works. We've seen it in D.C. where a few people hold up agendas. We wouldn't have been having the DACA discussion if the Speaker of the House, when I was in Congress, would have brought up the bipartisan bill that passed the Senate and would have overwhelmingly passed in the House, and we never got a chance to vote on it. So by holding things up and pushing them down, it exacerbates the problem. So today, I'm excited to be here with this group of folks. I'm excited for the day that can be historic in the Minnesota House of changing the way we view community safety, of changing what accountability looks like, and changing the way that communities feel like they have a voice in that. And so with that, I will add one of the founding members of the Posse Caucus, who we are certainly grateful for in Minnesota, is our Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan.
Thank you so much, Governor, and good morning, everybody. So a week ago, the governor and I stood together with our colleagues in the legislature, specifically members of the People of Color and Indigenous Caucus, and unveiled a package for police accountability and true reform. The deeply rooted issues of systemic racism and discrimination in policing is not new to our state. The bills in this package, they are not new either. Minnesotans, especially Black, Brown, and Indigenous Minnesotans, are crying out for these issues to be acted upon. Now is the time for real action. Not in a month, not next session, not in 5 years, but now. The entire world is watching what we do in Minnesota, and they expect us to be on the right side of history. A few weeks ago, we watched the murder of George Floyd. The entire world watched the murder of George Floyd. And you've heard many of us speak to this, and I want to mention it once again, because when George Floyd called out for his mother, the world shook and shifted. That is our call to step up for justice. And that call must be heard in the House, and it will be with these members, and in the Senate, for justice for George Floyd, but justice for so many who came before him. We must stand up and say enough is enough. It is the time that the police protect and serve us all, no matter your zip code, your ability, or the color of your skin. Real change can happen in this moment if the legislature acts. And there is movement in Minnesota. We are ready. Minnesotans are ready, and we need the legislature to be too. So let's see this through to the finish line. And with that, I am honored and humbled to introduce to you Commissioner John Harrington.
Good morning. I'm John Harrington, the Commissioner of the Department of Public Safety. George Floyd's murder is not going to be ever forgotten. Not by his family, not by his community, and not by police officers and peace officers here in the state of Minnesota or anywhere else in the world. This is a moment that galvanized everyone into making the change that we had seen coming, not just recently, not just in the last few years, but we've been seeing this coming for decades. The Attorney General, Keith Ellison, and I in January of 2019 saw this coming in a different way. We saw this as a community issue because both of us have spent most of our public careers working in community and working with community and listening deeply to the pain that the community talked about. And so right after Governor Walz's inauguration and the Attorney General's inauguration, the Attorney General and I got together to say, what could we do to stop the next tragedy? How could we prevent this from happening? And by March of 2019, we had already brought on Nicole Archibald, who came on as Community Affairs. We had already contacted 21st Century Policing, who did the Obama policing report, to begin a process to actually come up with a product that would actually prevent the next George Floyd from happening. By August, we were actually not just talking about this, but we had convened a working group. And it's a working group that I really think it's important because it really was an impressive group. It involved Representative Rena Moran and members of the Senate, Senator Ingebrigtsen. It involved academics from St. Thomas and the U of M. It involved police chiefs and police sheriffs and police unions at the table having a conversation about what could be. Not simply reflecting on what the tragedies of the past were. We all knew what those tragedies looked like, but we wanted to think about, in a broad way, what could be the future of policing? Just to make sure that you understand that this group was not just an echo chamber. The ACLU was at this table, community activists were at this table, the disability community was at this table, and members of Philando Castile's family, Clarence, his uncle, was at this table. We were all there together. And for 9 months, we argued and debated and took testimony and literally brought the subject matter experts from all over the world in to this conversation. We brought experts from Washington, D.C. think tanks, to legal scholars, to people that had reformed use of force in Camden, New Jersey. We brought folks who were on the front lines of holding police accountable from Utah and all points east and west from here. We debated these and discussed these and hammered out these. And what I want to tell you is that the 28 recommendations that we came up with, they were just the beginning. We didn't think we had done all that we could do. We did all that we thought we could do at the moment, but there was more work yet to be done. And we had made a promise, the Attorney General and I had made a promise that this document was not simply going to be another report that somebody was going to stick on a shelf. It was going to be a living, breathing work in progress that we were going to make and remake the world of public safety. We held 4 hearings, 3 listening sessions, and one of the things I think it's important for folks to know is that this, I think as many people think, well, use of force or deadly force is just a St. Paul and a Minneapolis issue. 60% of it happens in greater Minnesota, and most of our hearings were, in fact, in greater Minnesota. And I want you to know that in greater Minnesota, we heard from people who were concerned about police-community relations, who were concerned about deaths in custody, who were concerned about officer-involved shootings. They were concerned about use of force. This is not a Twin Cities issue. This is a state of Minnesota issue, and quite frankly, this is a United States issue. Broader even than that. Of the 28 recommendations, and I'm going to close shortly here, There are some that I think that just scream for enactment. We heard from chiefs in Camden, New Jersey, and I went out to visit them to actually see how their operation worked, about the sanctity of life, about how important that value statement was to how they operate in one of the toughest cities in New Jersey. We talked about and debated the absolute requirement for officers to intervene when they saw another officer doing the wrong thing, and the requirement to give aid as soon as possible. We talked about holding police accountable. We talked about body cams for every department in the state of Minnesota. We talked about making sure that police officers who see the worst side of humanity all too often were healthy when they came back to the job that they love. And finally, we talked about how do we rebuild. We recognize that there has been a breach in the fabric of trust between police and their communities that they serve. We recognize that from day one, and it was never far from our minds. And so we talked about how do we rebuild that fabric of trust that is the basic bedrock of good policing. Without trust in the police, there is no public safety. And without trust in the police and without the community support, nothing else good happens out there. We have to rebuild that trust. We have to rebuild our communities. We have to rebuild the peace in peacekeeping, the peace that is in the title of being a peace officer. At this time, I want to recognize my partner in preventing and reducing crime, the Attorney General of the state of Minnesota, Keith Ellison.
Thank you, Commissioner. And let me also thank Governor, Lieutenant Governor, because the effort that Commissioner and I helped to lead over the course of the year, last year, was one that was really a rewarding experience because it was tough at many times. We had a diverse group of opinions at the table. Community came and made themselves abundantly heard in the course of the work that we did. And it was all to the good. So I must take issue with any suggestion that the proposals in our report or the ones being entertained by the House at this time are somehow new. They're not new. These issues have been around for a long time. Our commission was bipartisan. It was bicameral. We did the work, and that work now is the work that needs to be, at least in part, completed. And I do urge that we take these legislative proposals up and to pass them as quickly as we can. Because before George Floyd breathed his last breath, we were working a year before to try to prevent that tragedy from ever happening. That's why we did this working group, Police Involved Deadly Force Encounters, which we issued in February. This report is prescient. And if we follow it and implement it, we can save the lives of people. Police officers, community, both. And so I just come today to just affirm the importance of this work, to congratulate and to thank the governor, lieutenant governor, for backing up the commissioner and myself in the work that we did, where we went all over the state. We learned valuable lessons, such as the importance of officer wellness. Officer wellness is a big deal. We had officers tell us we need to make sure that as we go out and see some of the harshest aspects of humanity every day, that we're ready to deal with the next case and mentally and emotionally prepared to do so. We listened to people from the mental health community who made it clear to us that their involvement is critical, because we learned that at least up to 50% of all deadly force encounters involve people who are in a mental health crisis at the time. We learned that people who are in an autism meltdown exhibit symptoms that are very similar to what police officers are trained to identify as an aggressive stance and somebody might actually hit you or harm you. And we need people to understand the distinction and the awareness. We heard from a diverse set of community partners, including community, including police. And as a matter of fact, we took fair amount of criticism for the work that we did, but we thought it was necessary because if we could get these ideas implemented into law, we could make sure that everybody goes home at night and everybody gets up the next morning. And so we urge action. We urge decision. We are in a historic inflection point that is being heard all over the United States and around the world. And Minnesota is the epicenter for it because we lost George Floyd right here on our streets. And so I ask people who are in a position to make a positive difference to do so. And delaying action is essentially denying action. And so with that, let me ask Kelly McCarthy, brand new chair of the Post Board, to come forward. Kelly?
Thank you, sir. Good morning. My name is Kelly McCarthy, and I'm here as the current chair of the Minnesota Post Board. I'm here this morning to communicate the Post Board's commitment to change, our commitment to working with both sides of the aisle, the legislature, and all of Minnesota to provide everybody with the policing that they deserve. It is very uncomfortable for many of us right now, but we need to be uncomfortable. Change is uncomfortable. And so if we see policies that we're really comfortable with or seem like more of the same, that indicates to me that we need to go farther. I hear a lot of comments about getting back to something or getting back to an element of safety. There is no back. We have to move forward, and we need to do so together. To move back or the status quo is fear and death for our Black and brown citizens. To go back or stay the status quo is fear and death for our Indigenous populations, for members of our community with mental illness, autism, our trans community. Backwards is death. We have to move forward, and we have to do it together. I often hear, where are all the good cops in this? You know, we throw out the bad apples, spoil the bunch, which is an analogy that I fully accept. The good cops are asking for the legislature to come together and give us clear rules and expectations and let us meet those rules and those expectations. And I think you will be surprised how much we can do when we all work together. So Post Board is committed to major change on a systematic level. I know the good police officers of Minnesota want there to be systems that prevent bad officers from joining our ranks. And if they do join our ranks, we need a way to get them out before they cause harm to other Minnesotans. So I just want to say thank you to everybody here for all of your work to give us those clear expectations. And it's my honor to introduce Speaker Melissa Horton.
Good morning. It's such an honor to be here with the governor, the lieutenant governor, Commissioner Harrington, our attorney general, the leader of the Post Board, and our outstanding Posse Caucus members. You know, based on the arbitrary and totally unnecessary deadline put forward by Senate Republicans, we are in our last 2 days of this special session. The House will be on the floor today at 5 p.m. to take up police accountability and reform legislation. We need systemic change in Minnesota and accountability. The legislation that was passed by the Senate provides neither. The House proposals have been shaped by the people of color and Indigenous caucus with the input of the community. And they would take real and meaningful steps towards systemic change and accountability. We need to stay as long as it takes to get the work done. The Minnesota House is not going to quit on Minnesota. The Minnesota House is not going to quit on this important task of creating systemic change and bringing about accountability. We hope that Senate Republicans will listen to the voices of Minnesotans and stay with us until the work is done. George Floyd's nephew testified in the hearing that Chair Mariani and Chair Moran held last Saturday. And he said, please don't rush this. We just got back from burying our uncle. We literally just got back from Texas. And I'm here and I'm sharing with you, but please give this the time that it needs. I have to thank our People of Indigenous Caucus and the Public Safety Chair. People of Color and Indigenous Caucus is chaired by Rena Moran. The Public Safety Committee chaired by Carlos Mariani. Never have two people worked harder in the space of time that these individuals have, and the entire team. But even more importantly than that, they heard from the community. They listened to the community. And this, as the Attorney General said, is not new work. This is work that Representative Mariani has been doing for the entire term of his service as the chair and before that. The morning of May 26, when I saw the picture of George Floyd, I texted Carlos right away. And I asked him to pick up the Ellison Harrington report and to pick up the work that our caucus had already done and already passed as a starting point and start reaching out, because I knew we would be called upon to act. We are ready to act. We're ready to join hands with the Minnesota Senate. This work does not begin and end today with a vote in the Minnesota House of Representatives, but that is the work before us today, and that's what we will be taking up. We're not going to quit until we achieve racial justice, systemic change, and accountability. With that, I would like to introduce Chair Mariani.
Good morning. When I was 11 years old, my neighborhood in Chicago exploded. Half of it burned to the ground. White supremacy had assassinated a great American prophet, Dr. Martin Luther King. In pain and desperation, my neighborhood burned itself. And an 11-year-old knew we all needed to find out why, to make sure that it wouldn't happen again. But it has happened again. It's happened again repeatedly. And it will keep happening again unless we get at the root of the issue. Let me be clear. It wasn't just one quote-unquote bad apple that killed George Floyd on May 25th. It wasn't only a quote-unquote bad apple that killed Philando Castile. No one single bad apple killed Jamar Clark, nor Kobe Heisler, or in Atlanta after George was killed, Rayshard Brooks, and so on, and so on, and so on. Black men killed by police officers. It's not the apples, it's the tree. And the tree doesn't have its roots only in Minneapolis. It has sprouted all across our nation. And whether we choose to see it or not, all across our state of Minnesota. The Minnesota Police Accountability Act, put together by African American, African immigrant, Latinx, American Indian, and Asian Hmong legislators, the Minnesota Posse Caucus, sees the root of this evil. And we know that doing more of the same only guarantees that what we saw across the nation, from Minneapolis to New York City, from St. Cloud to Oakland, from St. Paul to Atlanta, will happen again, as the American people want a new, healthy tree. And more of the same means someone else's black beloved will die at the hands of a state-licensed government public servant. That will happen again. Valerie Castile told us that painfully last Saturday. She gave us the numbers of people that have been killed, of African Americans who have been killed since her beloved son was killed by a police officer here in Minnesota. So with this in mind and in heart, because the Posse Caucus works from both the intellect and the spirit, the Posse legislators put together a powerful package of bills in 3 acts. The Reclaiming Community Oversight Act, because the tree needs intentional ownership of it by the people at both the state level and the local level. At the state level, through the Post Board licensing and discipline power. And so there are sweeping recommendations for both the construct, the purpose, the direction, the mechanics of data collecting, of analyzing that data, of forming policy with community relations, community policing at the center of all that, and yes, of discipline recommendations behind the power of licensing of the Post Board to nurture a better tree. And at the local level, through citizen review councils in all our municipalities that will monitor, inform, and act over local policing. The second act is the Reforming Accountability Act, because yes, individual wrongdoers do exist, and yes, they should always be brought to rigorous investigation and prosecution. The public trust demands nothing less than that. If there is no trust, there is no law. If there is no law, there's no order, there's no justice, there's no us, there's no society. And so this bill provides primary jurisdiction for the Attorney General over officer-involved deaths. It also creates a special unit within the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension that will be essentially a walled-off unit. And what that means is to minimize even the appearance of a conflict as they do their work, and they're great professionals there, but as they do their work to ensure that the public's trust is maintained as they interact with the very same law enforcement entities and individuals that they now must investigate. And there's a shift in the deadly force standards in that act as well. One that focuses on the sanctity of life, on the respect for human rights, and moving away from a purely subjective call on a police officer toward a reasonable standard in his or her decision to use deadly force. The third act is the Reimagining Public Safety Act, because learning how to do things differently and better and guided by anti-racist focus is precisely where hope lies. And it's also what people are asking for. So in this act, we have community-led interveners, whole responders, healers, trainers. We want to invest in a additive dimension to public safety. And we want to make sure that those who are doing the tough work, because policing can be very tough work, that those doing the tough work are healthy. There's trauma there also. And that trauma, unfortunately, manifests itself sometimes in peace officers' interaction with the public. We owe it to them, we owe it to us to make sure that we are in the process of keeping healthy, strong peace officers in our communities. to have their humanity restored, to be healed, to move past the trauma, and to see their neighbors, to see their communities as their beloveds as well. And then finally, the bill has, the act, the large act, has a number of important provisions. Provisions around chokehold regulation and banning, provisions around a duty to intercede, provisions to ban the so-called warrior-style training, which only feeds the paranoia. It's an abomination, quite frankly, to see those that we are providing public safety for as the enemy and to be easily prepared to use deadly force. It's an abomination. Peace officers absolutely should be able to protect themselves at all times. There are models that allow for that. This is a model that is obscene. So obscene that many police chiefs themselves will not condone it. And then there's a residency provision as well to be able to encourage that those who are part of this filled out, mature public safety vision that we have, our peace officers, reflect and come from the very communities for which they are helping to solve problems. So the Posse Caucus has put forth an intelligent design, has put forth a design that has been powerfully informed and shaped by community engagement of all stripes. We've communicated with law enforcement. I get it. We don't see eye to eye on a number of things. It's often very hard for any sector that's being reformed to embrace it. But it doesn't mean that we don't push them in order to drive the change, to create the healthy tree. What Minnesota needs in this moment is for the Minnesota Senate to catch up with the Posse Caucus's work. We gave that opportunity. We've been giving that opportunity for years now. Some of these bills Chair Moran has carried years ago. Some I carried years ago. Last year, we put together a comprehensive package of police accountability and criminal justice reform that didn't even entertain a look, a glance from our Senate counterparts. And now here they are, stuck, because they didn't engage in the people's work. But we're providing an opportunity now, just as we did last year, for them to catch up. I call on them to stop coming small to the table. They have small stuff. It's okay. I could do those small stuff. Most of us can do that small stuff. That's not the issue. Stop coming in small. Let's have the conversation about the tree. I call on the Senate to see the tree, to change the system, and to join the people who want to begin growing a healthy tree. Not one that allows fear, hate, racism, anti-blackness to do harm, and then after doing harm, manipulate the branches of that tree to hide and scurry away from justice. A system that no longer draws some of the worst attitudes in our society, but draws only the best is what we want. It's what everybody wants. And so the Posse proposal ultimately is an act of love. It's an act of love. It's an act of believing that together, all of us, across race and class and geography, can nurture a better tree, the tree that we deserve, a public safety policing tree that meets our values. And so I call on my Senate colleagues, don't miss this moment. That 11-year-old shouldn't have had to see what he saw in 1968 and then to see it again and again and again. Let's break the cycle and let's do it together. And with that, I call on my esteemed colleague, Representative Moran.
Good morning, everyone. On May the 26th, as we all watched the visual of George Floyd been murdered by police officer, it brought a shock not only to folks in Minnesota, but across the country. That is a visual that is forever etched in our mind, that we would never, ever forget. The lack of emotions, the lack of humanity, and the lack of care that we saw in officers, the ex-officers, Sovin's body posture, in his face, the lack of humanity reminded me that it must have been part of his everyday routine. He got up, kind of like shook his hand, got in his car, and went on about business. It is disgusting. And for the first time, in a real way, I believe that America, the world, got a sense of what African Americans, indigenous, and people of color have felt and known for generations. For the first time, I feel that they saw that. They felt that. They felt and saw what was wrong with our police department. And so you saw that reaction across the country of how they felt about the need for systemic change within the Department of Police. I have not yet been able to get to the place where I can see police officers as peace officers. And I say it. But I'm not the only one. There are so many, many, many more who do not see the police officers that patrol our communities as peace officers. And so here we are on a Wednesday as the country has asked for systemic change, accountability for police officers, for bad police officers who do bad things, for those bad actors that show up and take someone's life with excessive force. Here we are today with that. And I have to tell you that when I saw the senator's bills, I was insulted. I was insulted. And so many, many more from the community across the world are insulted that is what the senators decided to put forward. That has no accountability, no systemic change. I'm going to share with you what I'm feeling. What I am feeling is that when I saw those bills, it reminded me of the Civil War after the South lost and how the Confederates went back home to the South and how legislators showed up and began to enact Jim Crow laws. I'm not trying to compare and say what the senator introduced like Jim Crow laws, but in the moment in time we're in, they may be a comparable. And they began to enact Jim Crow laws that only did what the war didn't do for them, and that was to keep black people suppressed, and to keep black people devalued. So we are in a moment in time here in Minnesota to do the right thing, to hear the voices of the people, black people, indigenous people, Asian people, Latina people, brown and black people from across the world, and white people. This is not a black issue. This is not a people of color issue. This is a world issue. And those suburban moms are watching. They felt and they saw the murder of George Floyd. And that touched them just as much as it touched me and anyone who looked like me. So yes, I am insulted with the bills that the Republicans have brought forward. And I am reminded that when I decided to run as a state representative, that I was supposed to go into the Capitol to represent my district. But I also knew that my job was not just to represent my district, that I was a state legislator, and my job was to look statewide and do the best by our state. And if those Republicans in the Senate think that they're just looking out for their own cities, then maybe they need to go back and be the mayor of that city or sit on the city council, do something local. Because this is not about just them and their community. This is about all of us. We have some very, very good, strong accountability bills that we're just asking to weed out the bad cops and keep the bad cops accountable for bad behavior. I don't understand what is so hard about that, being accountable for bad people who do bad things and break the laws and kill people. Isn't that who we are as America? To my Senate Republicans, it is not okay. What you brought forward is not okay. And yes, the world is watching us. So as they rush to get out of town to go back to their home, where they are from, we ask them to look out for the people in the state of Minnesota and do the right thing and keep bad cops, bad actors out of uniforms so the good cops, who are there for all the good reason, can be seen for who they are, good cops, so that we have a stronger institution that is respected, that is trusted, and that holds themselves in partnership with communities accountable for bad actors. That is what we want. That is what we need. And that is where we are in the 21st century. So I ask them to join us. Thank you. To the governor.
Thank you, Representative. Thanks to everyone here. We're going to take some questions. You've got the authors of many of these pieces here, but I'm going to echo what you just heard. If destiny in history is not raining down on Minnesota today and tomorrow, I don't know what is. The image of us and the Senate walking away from systemic change on Juneteenth adds to the legacy of what the rest of the world is looking at here. It is unacceptable. We have demanded systemic change. The work has been done. The coalitions have been built. And it's our expectations that those bills will make it through the House this afternoon. They will go to the Senate, and they will be on our desk. And the poetic justice and the decency of being able to sign those bills on Juneteenth to make a change in this state is pretty obvious. And if that's not enough, Sunday's Father's Day, which George Floyd's daughter is not going to be around, his father's not going to see that. So I just have to tell you, the business as usual and the weak sauce legislation to get out of town and pretend like you made change ends now. We've seen this time and time again, begging for hearings on gun safety, begging for hearings on things that will make a difference. And the idea that we can, and I want to echo where Representative Moran said, if we truly don't make a hollow mockery out of one Minnesota, there's a responsibility to understand every community is touched by this. Every community matters, and who we are as a people. And it is going to permeate and continue to permeate every aspect of our lives, from education to the economy to just basic decency. So in a week that we have seen incredible news come out of the Supreme Court reaffirming human rights, let's do our part here in Minnesota. Let's let the spotlight, that hot spotlight that has been on this state for the better part of the last month, show our better angels, move incredibly good legislation, and go into this weekend with, as Carlos said, have planting that new seed, nurturing that tree that is truly about justice and is not about the same old stuff. And with that, I would encourage members as you ask questions, that the authors are here of many of these bills and many of these pieces of legislation. So.
Question about the Senate package, and specifically just one element of the Senate package, Senate File 104. I understand the categorization of the other parts of the Senate package is doing nothing, but what about Senate File 104? It appears to change state law, to turn it over to the Post Board to rewrite a state statute. You folks are the experts, obviously.
It's hard to even know where to start. Jamie Becker-Finn, state representative from Roseville. What happens in the legislature when we don't do our work is we ask work groups to do things and we direct other groups to do things. And what happens with that is that you end up with a really great report that was just held up here by our Attorney General and nothing actually changing in the law. So, you know, it's classic kicking the can down the road to dictate that some other agency or council do some work later. The urgency is now. The people are telling us that we need to do this work now. And to those who say that we're rushing this, we have followed the process. If you can talk to any member of the House in the past week and the number of hours that we have spent in committee hearings and hearing from the community, responding to emails, our voicemails being down from the number of people that we are hearing from, we've had the time to do the work while keeping the urgency, and the time to put things into law is now. The time to kick things down the road and allow a board or a work group or some other group to do the work. We're done with that. Now is the time, and we need to get the work done.
And I don't know if the Attorney General, who wants to take it, but as I understand it, you're sort of alluding to this. But what happened with the Senate bill is they transferred the language that was placed in your bill in the criminal code on the use of force doctrine and placed it in an administrative code that tells the Post Board, as John Lesh told me yesterday, to tell the cops to try again with their policy. I would like to get a real sense of how big a change that is, and is that something that the caucus can accept?
We're the lawmakers. We need to make the laws. We all know that if there aren't teeth to the things that we're doing, there won't be change. So absolutely, we're the lawmakers. We're making the laws. We have the language right here in front of us. We can do this now. It can be on the governor's desk tomorrow. And so now is the time. Enough with, finding ways to weaken the work that we're doing.
How different would it be if it were in the criminal code? What difference would it make? It would have the force of law, and what would that mean if it passed the way you have it now?
Well, I'm a prosecutor, so you'd have the criminal justice system versus somebody, which we've seen, unfortunately, with the way, we have beyond a reasonable doubt is a really high standard. And that's the standard we have for taking away somebody's liberty, which is different than a standard that we should have of basic decency and holding folks accountable in the way that we license people. And so we want to have the options to hold people accountable, but you look at what happened with the one time in history that a peace officer has been found guilty in any of these cases. And like I said, the beyond a reasonable doubt is a high standard, and it makes sense that that's a high standard, but there have to be other ways to hold folks accountable. But we want all those things on the table. We want to be able to hold folks accountable when they do things like harm the folks in our communities. Absolutely not. I will, as the governor stated, weak sauce. We have a real bill with many addressing all the things that Chair Mariani just walked through. He just walked through all those things. None of those things are radical. None of those things are crazy. None of those things are new. That's real change. When we talk about real change, we're talking about this big bill, not just these little piecemeal. What if could you take this tiny little thing? Enough. We're done with the tiny little things. We want real change, and the people are demanding that we do real change. I grew up in the Cass Lake Bemidji area. There were protests in Bemidji. There were hundreds of people in Bemidji. We have students at Bemidji State University organizing Black Lives Matter fundraisers. The whole state is watching, and the whole state is ready for this change. Now's the time.
And I would echo on that. This moving it to the administrative side, I feel very comfortable as long as Kelly McCarthy's there. She's not going to be there forever. And one of the ideas is if you do not codify these things, it's one of the reasons, and I know this may strike my GOP friends as strange, but the idea of using executive power is a weak substitute for the fundamental changes they're trying to make. They're saying and encouraging, well, why don't you just take executive order banning chokeholds? Well, the one thing is it doesn't have the force of law then after I'm gone, and it gets challenged because you didn't have the community conversation by making it happen. It's the same strategy of taking this out, of codifying it into statute and moving it over and making it administrative change. It does not work in the long run.
Is this almost at the point where you have to take it to the election and this gets decided in November, and could Senate Republicans and should Senate Republicans?
I certainly hope not. And I have tried, and I think some of you, in all fairness, and that's what your job, you look at this, I have tried, and I'm not going to say that I do think that it is not a pejorative to talk political differences, but I have tried hard to build coalitions. I think that's the governor's job. But I don't think you can compromise when it becomes a value issue. The fact of the matter is the Senate is trying to pass weak things that don't fundamentally change that, and that is foundational. They're trying to pass this piece of fundamentally transformative legislation. And I think if it's a choice and we get to the dead end, that is maybe what happens. But here's what I think about. Think about all of the bad that will happen between now and then. Think about this lost opportunity, and think about the message that it sends to Minnesotans, that they really want us to do this. I do not understand the objection on this. I especially don't understand the question that was a good one that was asked. Well, if you think this is a good change, why kick it down the road and send it over to administrative change instead of just doing the hard work? It's like nobody wants to take responsibility for it. So I'm fearful of that. I still think there's time, but I think we went into this special session under very hot terms, very politically charged terms, rather than an attitude. And I'm going to go back to this. It's one of the fundamental problems. The mockery of what passes for a hearing in the Senate. I served for 12 years in the United States Congress, and those hearings matter. Experts come in. You go to them. You attend them. You listen. To bring in people who have worked on this for decades and give them 3 minutes and snipe at their comments and then tell them to leave, that's just an insult. And I watched Chair Mariani's hearing, and it was emotional and hard and passionate and not a total agreement, as it should be. So I'm fearful that may be the case. We've still got time. But again, I'm just asking Minnesotans, what is the world going to think in the week of the centennial of the Clayton Jackson McGee commemoration, in the month that George Floyd died, of unrest on our streets and everyone talking about systemic racism having to be addressed? Major companies making changes on this, understanding that to get people to move and live here and the talent, we're going to have to show that this values everyone. Going home on Juneteenth and saying we just can't get there, I think it is just, that is unacceptable. Many times. Now, yes, we are calling and we are talking, and I will leave here this afternoon, and I will meet with House minority leadership, of trying to get them to get there, to try and move this. And this is the hard. Legislating's not easy. Democracy, if it were easy, everybody would have done it and they would have all lasted longer, but it doesn't. It's really, really hard work. In this moment, it is super hard work. I am trying to, and again, I kept telling, I will compromise until it comes to our values. And this one, I just have to say, I don't know why you can't pass this package. I don't know who is pushing back on this. Who is saying this is bad stuff? Who is telling you? Because you know what's really interesting about this is, have you seen any guests on any talk shows on TV? Have you seen anybody here stand up and say, we don't want to do what Representative Moran is doing because of this? It's a smoke and mirrors. It's a hand slight. It's this over here. This is good. Throw in apple pie as the state pie, and that'll make this bill even a little better. That's what's going on. So I'm trying, but I'm telling them, This is one you're going to have to come with us or be left behind by the state. And I hope we can get there.
What I think, at least in the Senate, is an unprecedented level of racial tension that spilled over into the debate with posse caucus members who apparently weren't even, it wasn't even known by some members that they existed, saying that they weren't being heard, saying that
I'll let people speak for themselves on this, and Mom or anyone who would like to speak about this. Yeah, I'm worried about this. There are numerous cases, and I think some of you are probably following. We had a situation with the IRRB that is now starting to undermine some of those. That every public discussion we're having now is starting to do what I think become an uncomfortable conversation about race in this state. And I'll let the folks who witnessed that, because I do think it was very uncomfortable. And I heard a lot of calls, in fact, the Lieutenant Governor called and made sure that I was watching and saw what was happening.
Thank you, Governor, Lieutenant Governor, the leadership that they put forward. I think the point where we have to say that the leader in our state, in the Senate, to say that he has never had the names that he had when he went to see the devastation. That speaks of volume, that we don't see people different. People from different walks of lives who are within the state, the racial injustice, the discrimination, the lack of understanding from our perspective, our lived experiences, it's shameful. We can go on when you put immunity in the bills that they just passed. When we had the peer-to-peer counseling and putting immunity for the law enforcement, that's wrong. That's sending the wrong message, that people can make their own statements when they're involved in any deadly force. What is wrong with understanding the legislation, the recommendation from the Attorney General and the Commissioner of Public Safety to craft legislation that is carefully crafted legislation that provides protection, that privacy that is needed, and then you end up putting some immunity into the process? It's the same thing that we're trying to avoid in the state, by giving people immunity when they commit deadly force, when they commit crimes. So this is looking at people who look like me. George Floyd isn't going back. He's gone. And for people to walk away from that and say we will go home is not acceptable. And we need to look things and say that race does not exist. We've had in the House of Representatives. And even calling our cities a bad place during last hearing in the Ways and Means, telling us to go create GoFund to rebuild the city, that sells it all. You need to hear from us. You need to see us for who we are. We are one Minnesota, regardless where you live, who you look like, who you worship. We got to build one Minnesota. And that's the message we want to send. Thank you so much.
I wanted to end right there. Thank you. That's a lot of words been spoken today. Few have summed it up clearer. Thank you, Representative Norm. Yes.
Thank you, Governor and Lieutenant Governor. It certainly shifts the responsibility, and we, of course, will enact whatever the legislature asks us to. There is an impermanence to it. There is another step that we would have to take where we have to get board agreement to do that. And so now you have 15 people that have to agree and then are going to put their recommendations and their spin on it. So it is certainly easier for us from a police legitimacy standpoint to say these are the things that our state values as a whole. These are the things that our state wants as a whole, and we, as the post board, are going to enact them. It does take a little bit different tenor if it's hey, this is from the post board, or the post board is the authority that's doing that. So we will, of course, whatever both sides of the legislature bring to us, we will make happen, and we'll do our best to do that. But I do think it sets just maybe a different permanency and tenor. So I believe if the legislature directs us to do it, we are not allowed to vote on it. However, there could be roadblocks to enacting it. I believe, and I didn't, is the date on that September 1, 2020 that they had asked, House File 04 had asked that that be implemented by 2020. But even if that, and was that right? So we would still have to implement that. That still takes time statewide. And so for a decision to come out this week, we would be able to move on it this week. So we'll get done for Senate File 104. Yeah, we'll be able to enact, and we'll do it as quickly as we possibly can, whatever comes out of the legislature.
Built in for smaller departments within the phraseology of the Senate bill, isn't there, I think?
In 104?
I thought that perhaps there was, I may be wrong, that they were making some exceptions for the smaller departments that might have difficulty enacting these kinds of things.
I didn't read that in 104, but I could be.
Something I'm conflating with something else.
Governor, what happens if nothing happens by Friday? Do you call them back? Do you keep talking offline if maybe they come back in July? What happens if nothing happens?
It will be we'll cross that bridge when we get there, but I do think it's important to talk about it now. I would consider this, I would consider it a total failure if we leave tomorrow, both on this important issue, on COVID relief funds to local entities, on bonding, and the rebuilding plans for Lake University Broadway. So certainly I consider the work to be the most important. I've said we have to get it done. I mean, we found ourselves this week not being able to hold bipartisan meetings because everybody was so rushed. And my thought is the only reason we're rushed is that you said Friday. Why don't you just change that till Tuesday? And that gives us a lot more time to actually have these really important conversations that's going to happen. We had to cancel a four-corner meeting because we just couldn't fit it all in. And I have to tell you, we were talking about police reform, and people told me they had other meetings to go to. What were those meetings that were more important? I did not get that answer. What was the meeting that the governor, the lieutenant governor, and others were on the phone, and we just couldn't have that meeting this week? 72 hours from adjournment. Heck, no, 48 hours from adjournment. And we couldn't have that meeting. So I'm obviously publicly frustrated on this, but this is part of the job to bring folks back together. Part of this is bringing it up here. I would ask, have that press conference and bring the people up here who want to stand here and tell you why these are bad ideas. Tell them why what Representative Norris said is not at the heart of what we're doing. But what we get is quick little hearings over there, 3 minutes, and then nothing. And so we're highlighting these. They've been vetted. You're asking important questions about them. But we need the other side to tell us why they're doing that. Why is that section? I mean, I find it so interesting, too, is giving that power to the post board. The governor appoints people to that post board for times whatever. Why would they allow that to happen? I thought we were trying to take back, and we can't have this type of authority. Make the decision. Don't make a governor-appointed post board member take a vote or make the decision. You make the decision. That's what you were elected to do, and that's what people are asking us to do. So that's why that one frustrates me.
Conversations going on between yourself, legislative leaders, and others about funds available, other priorities that you can done by tomorrow?
I don't know, Speaker Hortman, do you want to talk? You have been instrumental. I said this last year, and I will say it again now. Speaker Hortman is fantastic about continuing to bring people back to the table when it appears like they can't, continuing to ask for new ways to do this, and this week we've been doing that together. So.
Well, it seems like several lifetimes ago, but the big stumbling block on a bonding deal was Minority Leader Doubt's statement on May 2nd that until there was some change in the governor's executive authority, that there wouldn't be a bonding bill. Even though that's a preposterous statement, and even though those two things should not be tied together, there's thousands of jobs that will be created by the bonding bill that should not be held hostage to Minority Leader Doubt's concerns about the governor's executive authority in the COVID-19 pandemic. We have continued to talk. We were on the phone this morning for an hour, the four leaders. I think that the artificial deadline is making this very difficult. I think we are this close to getting something on bonding and the Republican requirement of a tax bill. I know that Minority Leader Doubt and the governor will be meeting later today. And hopefully they can make some progress on those Chapter 12 issues. But there's no reason that we couldn't wrap this up very, very soon. But everybody has to bring a spirit of wanting to get things done and a willingness to compromise. I have said to my colleagues, we're very good at fighting, but we're also very good at getting things done when we actually decide that we want to do that. And there's a time to try to get along, and there's a time to fight. On criminal justice reform, police accountability, systemic change, we are going to fight hard. We're going to fight like hell for the things we value. But we also have to find that space to work together and get things done in those areas where we should and can get the work done.
All right, we're at the end of time here. We will speak more. We've got basically what amounts to about 36 hours to get this work done. I would just ask Minnesotans to expect us to do that, expect compromise, as the Speaker said, but do not accept compromise where your neighbors' lives are literally at stake. Do not accept compromise where who we are and the core of who we are as a people are at stake. And these proposals that are being put forward are enacted in other places and working, so we can do that. So I want to thank you all.